At the beginning of the 1960s, a weird theme park once stood as a near exact replica of Disneyland in California. But if you look a little bit closer, this Japanese park wasn't exactly an exact replica. In fact, everything in this bootleg park was all a little off. It was called Nara Dreamland, and for decades, it was perhaps the strangest theme park on the planet. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 101st episode of Abandoned, let's take another updated look at the story behind one of the most infamous theme parks to have ever existed. One that once entertained millions as Japan's weird, unofficial Disneyland. A park that over time would only become more strange and unsettling, to the point in fact where it was left completely abandoned. It all started with a man named Kunizawa Matsuo, a Japanese industrialist and entertainment businessman. In the late 1950s, Matsuo would make a trip out to America, particularly California. Deeply interested in the entertainment industry, he would make a special trip out to the newly opened and much hyped Disneyland Park in Anaheim. Seeing the enormous success of the park in America, and knowing there was a growing interest of Western culture back in Japan, Matsuo had pictured something just like this being as successful back in Asia. Now, it's been widely reported that Matsuo had entered into an agreement with Walt Disney himself to bring the Disneyland park and IPs back to Japan. It's been quoted in many places and even written about in Japanese books, but the verification on these claims are a little sketchy. As the story goes, Disney either demanded too much in terms of licensing, or the agreement fell apart for other reasons. Regardless of the actual validity of these meetings and the supposed agreements, Matsuo was completely set on building his own Disneyland park in Japan. He would choose a site in the ancient city of Nara, just outside of Osaka and Kyoto, and around 400 kilometers south of Tokyo. Matsuo would form a new corporate entity called the Dreamland Company, and he would choose a site in Nara that was previously occupied by a former US Army base left over from World War II. This new park was going to replicate much of what he had already seen in California, and in 1961, Nara Dreamland would open to the public. The 125-acre park was a near spitting image of Disneyland in California. It was not only advertised in TV commercials as the new Disneyland of Japan, but it was touted in the press as a $14 million construction project, $1 million more expensive than the original California park. Though if you actually saw it in person, I don't think you would really be able to point that out. Dreamland was in pretty much every single way a very close replica to the California park. Pretty much every major attraction and icon of that original park would be found here, right down to the very design and layout, as Dreamland was a hub-and-spoke design, with each land surrounding a central main street and castle in the middle. Fantasyland, Adventureland, Tomorrowland, and unique to this park, Ancestorland, would all contain the many attractions within. Again, all of these are basically copies of those found in California. For example, you'd be greeted with a train station when first walking in, complete with a train that circles the entire park. You'd also find vintage vehicles driving up and down Main Street, a much less detailed Matterhorn mountain with a bobsled attraction running through it, and a skyway gondola crisscrossing each side of the park. A submarine attraction would circle a lagoon in Tomorrowland, right below an actual monorail system. In Adventureland, you'd find the Jungle Cruise Ship. And while most of the attractions were renamed, some just weren't. Dreamland was in nearly every single way a bizarre imitation that never really got the level of theming right. But it was also one that certainly delivered on its own charm. With a cast of newly created characters to populate its own IP, the Japanese public loved the park. In many ways, this was a first for the entire country, and quickly after opening, Dreamland was an enormous success, ultimately reaching 1.6 million visitors a year. With such a tremendous opening, Kunizawa Matsuo was already being called Japan's Walt Disney. And with apparently no legal or copyright issues coming from the American company, he was setting his sights on expansion, building another Dreamland theme park just outside of Tokyo. This one, however, looked a lot less like Disneyland. Dreamland back in Nara would continue to evolve though. As the decades went on, less emphasis was put on theming, and new generic amusement park attractions were installed. Some were very successful though, like the corkscrew roller coaster, which was placed right next to the castle in the late 1970s. While new flat rides were introduced in the coming years, a water park element was also constructed, replacing Ancestorland in the 1980s. These were decent attendance boosters and overall investments to the park, but it turned out to not nearly be enough to compete with what was coming. Over in Tokyo, a real estate corporation called the Oriental Land Company was attempting to persuade the Walt Disney Company to license their IPs and allow them to build a real Disney theme park in Japan. Disney was reportedly quite upset over the Nara Dreamland park and was hesitant to expand internationally. However, by 1979, a deal was reached, and in 1983, Tokyo Disneyland would open to the public, an immediate and enormous success. While Nara Dreamland was seeing over 1.5 million people a year, Tokyo Disneyland was already welcoming their 10 millionth guest after just a year of being open. This obviously affected Dreamland, and with dropping attendance, there was already a palpable decline in the condition of the park. Documented in 1990 by Kim Peterson, the park by this point was looking very tired and extremely empty during an October weekday. Besides the sheer eeriness of a nearly empty park, even by this point, there were clear signs of wear and tear on almost everything. For example, gift shops looked disheveled and messy, while buildings were left unwashed and stained from weathering. There was clearly not a high level of quality control that they were going for. This was while weeds were peeking through cracks in the pathways and trash was left littering the grounds. The years weren't kind to the larger park icons, like the Matterhorn, its little texture and flat sides now stained by the years of humid summers and cold winters. Its bootleg bobsled attraction within was looking even more shoddy, with its lift hill revealing the exposed steel structure illuminated only by strung-up Christmas lights. Clearly the park was struggling, and despite how dire the situation looked during this time, Dreamland would continue to stay above water. By this point, Kunizo Matsuo had long since passed away, and the company which owned Dreamland to this point had now been acquired. This new corporate owner would invest more into the park. Additional flat rides and a vintage car track were added through the 90s, and even a wooden coaster called the Asuka was installed in 1998. However, these additions made little difference to park attendance. In 2001, Tokyo Disneyland Resort had expanded with yet another massive theme park, Disney Sea, arguably the most detailed park in their entire portfolio. This was all while Universal Studios Japan had opened the same year. Unlike Disney though, Universal had built their park in Osaka, just 22 kilometers away. As a result, Dreamland once again took a huge attendance hit, and the park was now in a pretty rough state. By 2002, the facility had switched to a seasonal operating schedule, only open during weekends and holidays in the winter, as attendance was said to have dropped to 400,000 visitors. By 2005, the park was in serious trouble. Nara Dreamland was being run like a cheap amusement park by this point, in sheer contrast to the flashy new, ultra-detailed theme parks from Universal and Disney. The park was now turning into a creepy, low-effort mess, operated on what looked like a shoestring budget, and staffed by a skeleton crew. With an immense lack of visitors, guests would walk through rusting queues for rides, only to find there was no ride operator present. Mascots would walk around aimlessly amongst a rotting Sleeping Beauty castle with shingles falling off. Decaying corners of Main Street would have trash littering the street with service vehicles parked out in the open. Actually, all throughout the park you would just find random service vehicles strewn about. It was all clearly on its last legs, and the very fact that this bootleg Disneyland even existed in Japan was really the only novelty it provided. Remove the decaying castle, the poor imitation of the Matterhorn, and the painfully slow monorail, and all you have is a very sad theme park waiting to be shuttered. Indeed, the park was operating on borrowed time. Following a transferal of land ownership to a new real estate firm and continued low attendance, Nara Dreamland would close permanently on August 31st, 2006. With the corporate owners of the park falling behind on their taxes and not all that interested in even redeveloping the site, especially given the cost to demolish everything, Dreamland was incredibly just left as it was. Already following its closure, weeds were already breaking through the cracks in the parking lot, and the entrance topiary was growing out of control. It wouldn't take long until people began to evade the lax security and found their way inside the park. Over the next couple of years, explorers would document the quickly deteriorating Dreamland. which had gone from a relatively frozen state of 2006, with foliage growing out of control, to a complete apocalyptic wasteland by the 2010s. Through this time, little had actually been done inside the park, so everything was basically left exactly as it was the day it closed. Creators like The Proper People and Exploring with Josh would show just how eerie and stuck in isolation this property really was. This knockoff Disneyland was now slowly rotting away, and evidence of people getting inside was becoming apparent. The main street was now overgrown by weeds and tall grass, while the buildings had boards over their broken windows and graffiti covering some of the facades. The surreal sight of a clearly abandoned main street with a decaying, graffiti-covered Sleeping Beauty castle at the end is truly an insane sight. Over in Tomorrowland are the remnants of the monorail, now with smashed windows, a disheveled interior, and most of the body covered in graffiti. Elsewhere are the overgrown coasters like the Aska, covered in thick vines, or the Corkscrew, also overgrown by the foliage surrounding it. The Fantasy Coaster, a family-friendly attraction, had now been swallowed by the forest, its track and supports rusting away. The Jungle Cruise was in a similar state, with its dock rotting away and the boats, all tied together, now heavily decayed, some even slowly sinking. While many outdoor attractions were in very bad condition, in contrast, if you walked into a former restaurant or dark ride, you could tell they were a lot better preserved. But still, the park as a whole was truly an incredible sight. Something so surreal that it was hard to believe it was even a real place. But it wasn't looking like that was going to be the case for long. Throughout all of this time, interest in the land and redevelopment was low. Local land zoning regulations and the existing challenges of the site made it difficult to sell. The owners had also fallen behind in taxes, and the city ultimately seized ownership of the park. They planned to bring it to auction and hopefully get something moving, ideally with someone coming in and demolishing it. So, by November of 2015, the site was brought to auction and only one company made a bid, that being SK Housing. They purchased the land for an equivalent of around $7 million US, and that price was truly rock bottom. A local news outlet called the acquisition unparalleled for how cheap it traded for. SK Housing was generally a pretty small real estate company, only owning a few office buildings and had no experience with clean sheet development. While their intentions for the site were unclear, they did ultimately agree to demolish the existing structures at the plea of local police and residents. The park by this point was heavily vandalized and a constant nuisance for the community. Finally, after sitting abandoned for over 10 years, demolition had begun. This started with a clearing out of the interior structures, particularly those on Main Street, which had all of their contents thrown into separate piles along the main thoroughfare. Then the heavy machinery would come in, completely tearing away those Main Street buildings. By mid-2017, all of the structures on the site had been demolished. But any future development on the former park was still hindered by the strict land zoning. And at the time of writing this, while developers are currently working on a plan to introduce a special zoning allowance for the site, nothing has been approved yet. Meanwhile, a portion of the now flattened land was being reused, specifically for a small parking lot and a baseball field. One that now, at least partially, occupies the former site of the monorail and vintage cars. However, while some parts of the property have been returned back to the community, at least temporarily, other parts still remain abandoned, a clear reminder of the past. The former Esplanade entrance, for example, all of the original concrete remains in place, and from the main road, you can even still see the archways guests would walk through to enter the park. Likewise, surrounding the entire property are the same fences, some still displaying the former name on the mailbox. Even the stairs up to the Main Street train station still remain in place, a ghostly reminder of an equally ghostly theme park. When you look back at it all, it is truly astonishing that something like this existed. It's certainly a relic of its time, and something that would never get built now in our modern era of copyright and IP laws, at least not at this scale. The fact that Kunizo Matsuo traveled to America, admired what the Disney company had built, then came home and in just a few short years built his own bootleg version of Disneyland, it's just truly insane. And while this park was a pretty shoddy, sort of half-assed attempt to replicate the aspects that made the real Disneyland special, Nara Dreamland, no matter where the idea came from, was objectively revolutionary for Japan. It was something the Japanese had never seen before and brought themed entertainment to the country. paving the way for a surge in entertainment enterprises all across the nation. But as time went on, and as other larger and more legitimate parks opened up, the novelty and uniqueness of Dreamland began to wear off. The public increasingly began to view the park as a cheap, uninspired, unauthentic, and illegitimate operation. By every passing year, Dreamland only got less impressive and more of a mess. It became a relic of a time now long passed by, and with a depressed Japanese economy and new corporate owners, it was only a matter of time before this bizarre, truly surreal knockoff Disney theme park was left completely abandoned. If you like this video and want to support my work further, I do have a Patreon page where you can support the channel and get unique perks like your name at the end of each video, exclusive updates on my upcoming documentary, merch, and so much more. You can find it at patreon.com/brightsunfilms. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.